It's a new year for us, obviously. Start the first Sunday of a new year, and I showed that only because every year we make resolutions like them. I too want to lose 10 pounds, at least 5. And 5 times probably call my mother, which is 5 more than last year. So we all make these promises, but the reason why we constantly have to make these New Year's resolutions over and over again is because, as we talked about last week, we're really messy people. The church is a really, really messy place, filled with messy people like you and me. And we're continually breaking these resolutions, we're continually breaking these promises, but we have to renew them, we have to do them again. And what we're starting to do in this new year is we're starting to look at that messiness in the church. We're starting to look at the way Paul looks at it in the book of 1 Corinthians. And he's writing to this church filled with really, really broken people. People who want a year to be different, this year to be different than last year, something to change, for them to find peace. And they keep just making mistake after mistake and keep messing up. And Paul is writing to them, and he's trying to say, listen, people, let's get real. You're really messed up. But what we saw last week was they're messed up, but chosen. And that makes all the difference in the world, is that you and I are incredibly messy people in the church, but we're incredibly loved as well. And if you balance those two out, it will radically change your life. It really, really will. It will start to do it, because that's the gospel. That's what Jesus Christ says to you. He says, on the cross, I give my life for you, if you're in your messed up condition, because I love you. Now, Paul is writing to this church in Corinth, and he's saying, really, people, let's get real. Let's get real. There's some real issues here that we're going to have to tackle, and they're very, very sensitive. And they're things that people at church don't usually like to talk about that much. But Paul says, we're going to talk about them. Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about them. And the thing you should know, too, about this church in Corinth, we talked a little, I won't give you the history lesson too much, but if you weren't here last week, we talked a little bit about the city of Corinth. That it was an extremely cosmopolitan city. It was a thoroughfare between sort of the east and the west, and you had people, transient people coming in, sailors and military people, and you had merchants who were working in the city, and it was extremely cosmopolitan, extremely a big city, and extremely diverse. People going from east to west and back and forth, not staying for all too long. And so, what we know from the church is that if that's the city that the church was in, then the church probably looked like that city a little bit. Extremely diverse. People from all different racial backgrounds, people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. And let me tell you something. When you put people like that in a room, it gets messy. It gets uncomfortable at times. Think about it. Think about it this way, honestly. If you imagine the sanctuary, okay, as the church of Corinth, okay, back over here, I'm not talking about anybody in particular, by the way, in this room, but back over here, you're going to have, probably a military guy, a soldier who's come in, and he's probably on or off duty, and he's in here for a few months. And then up in the front, you're going to have some sailors, and they weren't the nicest bunch of people either, but they're here to worship in the morning, and they're sitting up front. And then over here, you probably have Paul, because Paul planted this church, and Paul was the short guy. He didn't really speak too well, but extremely intelligent, extremely knowledgeable, from a good background, good family. And then up here, Peter, because we know that Peter probably visited this church in Corinth too. So now you have Peter here, and Peter's the big dog, right? He's the leader of the church back in Jerusalem. But he's probably still out fishing a lot, so he probably stinks a little bit of fish. He's got ready hands. He's the blue-collar worker of the crew. Then you got Apollos sitting back here. And we know from the book of Acts that Apollos they called him, he was gifted with his tongue. He was an orator, a great preacher. And then you have mixed in this church, you probably still have some merchants, some sort of low-level kind of workers. And here's the coolest part. Over here you'd have a slave, and over there you'd have a master, worshiping together. Could you imagine that during coffee hour? How awkward that would be? All these people getting together, having coffee and donuts. It gets messy. Diversity breeds messiness. And in this church, what we find in the church of Corinth is that the diversity here has bred conflict. Oh, conflict. Good old church conflict. Good old church messiness. Where you don't agree with someone, where you look around and say, how dare they? Can you believe what they said? Can you believe what that person told me? Can you believe what the preacher said? All these people getting together from all different backgrounds. And what happens, it's a beautiful thing too. See, I have a 4-year-old, a daughter, and I get to watch too many cartoons. And one of the gems that I love watching is Strawberry Shortcake, which I've watched at a record-setting pace now. And there's a song in there, Peppermint, you know Strawberry Shortcake. Everybody, don't pretend like you don't know it. Strawberry Shortcake and then Peppermint Patty, and everybody's like, there's Citrus Sally, or I'm so sad that I would even know that. And there's all these different people, and there are all these different characteristics, and they're all like one type of candy or one type of fruit or something like that. And there's a song in there where Peppermint Patty, she starts singing, if everyone could just be like me, the world would be a perfect place. If everyone could just be like me, just be like me. And it's true. If everyone was just like you, it would be perfect, but it'd be incredibly boring. And the church in Corinth is a great example of what conflict can do and how to resolve it, what conflict is in the church, because there is conflict. And today you may be in conflict with somebody in the church or somebody from your past church experience, and if you don't, there's an old Mark Twain line. He says, if you don't have a problem with somebody, then you don't know them well enough. And he says, just wait, ... Meaning, every time that you get to know somebody, the deeper that you get into somebody in relation with them, you're going to have conflict with them. There will be some times that they rub you utterly the wrong way. There's be times that you can't believe what they've said to you, how they've wronged you, or how they did something against you. And in church, we can get this conflict exacerbated by like 10 times. Why? Because it's just like a hospital where sick people go to hospitals. Only messy people go to church. And if you put a bunch of messy people who are extremely different than one another all together at one time, you're bound to have conflict. And Paul this morning addresses this conflict in the Corinthian church. I want to look at what the conflict is, what's underneath the conflict, and then how Paul says to resolve conflict. And I'm not talking about conflict in your marriage or your relationships. That's a whole other sermon. We got a YouTube channel. I preached on that before. I'm talking about good old-fashioned church conflict, church battles. Do we clap? We don't clap, right? We don't clap here. Do we sprinkle or do we dunk? We do a little both. We don't sprinkle. Do we stand up? Do we sit down? Do we have coffee or do we have tea? Little things that get blown into big things. And that's what's happening in this church in Corinth. That's what Paul wants to address. But underneath it, there's a heart condition. In all of our conflict, that's the same. And Paul will root that out for us today. But the coolest part is he gives the most unique and radical way to resolve conflict that you probably would never have imagined. Let me explain this conflict first. I'm going to explain it on the surface what it is, and then I'm going to get down underneath it. Mark read what's going on here. He read from chapters 1 and chapter 3. Chapter 1, the very first part of the letter that Paul's writing to these people, and he says, guys, can't we all get along? What's the problem? Well, the problem was this. In the church in Corinth, some people, they divided into about four different factions that we know about. Now, they haven't broken the church apart just yet, but that was probably going to come later on. They divided into 4 groups, and this is essentially what the 4 groups of people were saying. And it's not too different than what happens in the church today. One group was saying, I like Paul. I'm going to follow Paul. Why? Because Paul was the one who started the church. He was the evangelist. He was the hard worker. He's the one who served and suffered, and he got beaten and bruised many times over and again for doing this. He was the one who labored. And there would have been people in the church who would have said, I follow him. I like him. And there's some people who said, no, I like Apollos. And I just mentioned Apollos. Apollos was a great speaker. So these are people who are like, I like him because he's a great preacher. Unfortunately, we don't have that problem here, so you don't have to worry about great preaching here. You have Apollos, he's the great preacher, and everybody says, I want to follow him. And some people say, no, I'm going to follow Paul. And I know Paul doesn't preach such good sermons, but he's the laborer, and that's who I want to follow. And then another group says, no, I want to follow Cephas. This is Peter. Oh, Peter, the big guy, the man in charge. He's the leader. He's the man. Back in Jerusalem, he's the man. And everybody says, I want to follow him. He's got clout. He's got prestige. So I follow him. See what's happening now? People say, well, I follow the servant guy. I follow the good preacher. Well, I follow the charismatic leader who's in charge of everything. And there's still another group, and they look really religious, by the way. They say, no, I follow Christ. And on the surface, you're like, well, that's the right group, right, Pastor? They follow Christ. Not really. Because commentators point out to the fact that they're still being divisive. Even when they say, I follow Christ, they're still being divisive. They're saying, you're over there, I'm over here. There's something between us. I follow Christ. And then commentators translate this to be a sort of a smugness. These are the folks in church who say, you have your way, but God's behind me. God's on my side. I love that about church conflict, don't you? When people get mad at each other in church, they pull out the God card. God's on my side. Sorry, you lose. It happens all the time. That's what these people are doing. They say, I follow Christ. Good for you. Take Paul. I'll take God. At the root of all of this, fundamentally speaking, every person in this group is saying one thing and one thing alone. My way is the right way. Your way is the wrong way. I win, you lose. Zero sum. You see, this is the heart of all conflict. The heart of all church, especially in the church, and even more so in the church, is people saying, listen, that works for you, but I know the right way. I'm right, you're wrong. My way, not yours. I win, you lose. It's people positioning themselves into the glory seat. And here's the thing about church. These little divisions start as a small whisper. There's nothing wrong with liking Paul, and there's nothing wrong with liking Apollos and his good sermons, and there's nothing wrong with liking Peter and his great leadership. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's how it starts. And it builds, and it builds. Let me give you a modern day example. It could start as simple as this. The little whisper that you hear saying, I deserved the credit for that. The little whisper saying, I worked so hard. How dare they clap for that person? The little whisper that says, the pastor didn't thank me enough. The little whisper that says, what about me? See, at the root of all this conflict, that's what they're saying. That's what everybody in this group is saying. In all these different four groups, they're all saying, what about me? My way, not yours. I win, you lose. Sit down. I'm the one in charge. They're all jockeying for the glory seat, the place of honor. That small little whisper that says, I deserved that. I worked for that. How dare they? And there's a part in the Screwtape Letters where Screwtape, if you know the story, is writing to his nephew Wormwood, and he's teaching him how to corrupt humankind and how to do it very, very subtly. And he's saying, don't just throw sin in their face, basically, but slowly and quietly get them to come over to our side. It won't work if you're overt and in their face. They'll never come over to the evil side. He says you have to do it subtly. You have to do it quietly. And there's a point where he writes this. He says, we must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives with the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. Let me read that one more time to you. He's writing to his nephew, and he says, listen, this is hell. And it can be hell on earth. He says, we must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives with the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. You see, on the surface, all these people were arguing about was who's the better preacher, who's the better leader, but it was breaking their church. Why? Because deep down in their hearts, they were divided within themselves into a perpetual cycle of self-importance, of self-advancement. It's when they look at each other and say, my way, not yours. I win, you lose. Listen to me, I'm in charge. And Screwtape tells Wormwood, he says, it starts with that small whisper about what you deserved, about what you earned. But it'll grow into a loud roar that will rip apart not only you, but the church too. That's what was threatening this church. That's what could threaten any church, because we're all messy. We're all needy. And in that need, when we confront need to need, and I see you and your neediness, and you see me and my neediness, it's ugly, and we don't like it, and it'll rip us apart. But Paul gives an answer. He gives an awesome, awesome answer. Let me explain his answer first. This is how Paul says, if you want to resolve conflict within the church, if you want to resolve conflict with your brothers and sisters, and keep in mind, this church in Corinth, they were dragging each other into court and suing each other. It was ugly. It was brutal. It was an ugly, messy church. And he says, there's one way to fix it. And throughout the book of 1 Corinthians, he says, hey guys, I urge you, can we just get along? You know, you feel like he's just exasperated, saying, guys, just get along. And it's not working. And we have, from history, we probably know that he wrote 5 different letters to this church, back and forth. We only have 2, but he writes back and forth, and they write him. And things just aren't getting better until chapter 11. One of the most famous chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians. And Paul does something really cool. In chapter 11, he talks about another conflict that they're having. He says, there's still dissensions between you people. You still aren't getting along. Here's how you get along. And he starts to explain the Lord's Supper. Now, think about this, and I thought about this for a while. That's a rather odd way to say, get over your conflict, right? If you have 2 of you have conflict, please don't, if you do, let me know. I'll sit you down and we can talk, we'll have a coffee, and we'll resolve it peacefully and amicably, right? That's how you do things, you talk it out. Paul says, no. He says, you guys are in conflict, and in chapter 11, he goes right from conflict into the Lord's Supper. Here's what he's doing. He says, in the Lord's Supper, in chapter 11, he says that Jesus stands up and says, this is my body, which is for you. And we're going to do this in a little while. We're going to take this Lord's Supper. But why would Paul say that? Why would Paul look at these people who are in conflict with one another, who are fighting over little tiny things and big things, all dragging each other into court, and he says, this is my body, which is for you. He says, listen, people, if you want the ultimate resolution to conflict, it comes here. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you were here on Christmas, I explained that I used to live in China. We lived in China just recently. And I don't know why, I had this really bad habit in China where in a restaurant, if you go to, you guys know this, some of you are from China. If you go to a nice restaurant, there's always a big round table, right? That all the people sit around and things like that. And I found out the hard way and the embarrassing way that there's one seat that's called the seat of honor or something like that. It's the one seat, you know what I'm talking about, guys? And it's the seat that faces the door, right? So that, I think it is, right? If I'm correct, yes, I'm getting a confirmation here. And this is how bad really my illustrations are worked out. So you sit down in the seat of honor, and it's facing the door because all the food comes in. You're the one who's looking at all of this food, and everybody's gathered around this big, huge banquet table for you. And I had this really bad habit where I always mistakenly sat in that seat without realizing it. All the time, I would go in and sit, and then, like one of my friends would be like, Aric, you must think a lot of yourself there, hey, everybody's going to give you all the food and cater to you because you're in the seat of honor. And I'd have to sheepishly get up and move. And I don't know why, but I always did that. I kept going back and forth and sitting down in the seat of honor. And listen, why do I tell you that? Because at the Lord's Supper, Paul says, when Jesus stands up and says, this is my body, which is for you, what he's doing is he's getting out of the seat of honor, and he's putting you in it. See, I was always mortally embarrassed when I sat in the seat because it meant that I was trying to make more of myself than I am. And that's how we all operate our lives. That's the root of all church conflict, of conflict at all, is that we always say, I'm in the seat of honor. I'm in the place of glory. You bow to me. You follow me. I win. You lose. My way, not yours. And Jesus, who had every right to sit in the seat of honor, he stands up at the Lord's Supper, Paul says. And he says, this is my body, which is for you. Not my way, your way. I lose, you win. My life for yours. He gets out of the seat of glory, and he goes to the cross so that you and I, who spend all of our lives trying to sit in that seat of honor and glory and heap praise and affirmation upon ourselves, for once, we don't have to do that. He puts us in the seat because he gives his life up for that. Paul says, that's the answer to your conflict. stop putting yourself in the seat of glory and know that he put you there. Because he lost his glory when he went to the cross to die for you. This is my body, which is for you, Jesus says. You see, everybody in the church in Corinth was edging for their way, their rights, what they've earned, what they deserved. And Paul says, you're never going to stop doing that until you look to the one who had all the rights, and he gives it up for you. He stands up from the table so that you and I can sit at the table to worship him, to love him. That's the only answer that I know, is that by his grace, he would lose his life. For me? Yeah. I'm messy, but I'm loved. And that's the proof. Go in silent prayer now.